this is a body of work that I've been developing for probably the last, well, in a low-key way since about 2010. And alongside this body of work, I've been working on producing the research ideas and writing for PhD. And in many ways, these things were parallel processes for me, where I would be engaged with a set of practices that I guess we can say come from the visual or creative or fine arts or plastic arts, some people call it in translation, and that would be work that was predominantly lens-based or performative. So I would make this work, and I've been in the process of making work as an artist, which is a kind of subjective position and an economy that I sort of exist in a sort of complicated way. I teach in an art school, so that sort of like gives me a very kind of precise location, but I don't have gallery representation, which sort of like, okay, well, what is the kind of way in which you exist as an artist, if one calls oneself an artist at all? But part of the labor of wearing the subjectivity of being in a university comes with a certain kind of intellectual practice as well. And I've always been very much involved in that in different ways. My prior degree to the one that I'm studying for now is not a practice-based degree. It's a master's in cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, and that sort of like gives me it's an added complexity to the kind of complex subjectivity I occupy in this. I mean, to cut a long story short, the PhD was always supposed to be a written PhD, what they would call a conventional Doctor of Philosophy. But I was still registered in the Department of Fine Art at the WITS School of Art, which, you know, added a complexity to it. It was, I think, about 2 years ago that this cycle of work, Paradise Fallen, started to gather steam and started to take a central place in my thinking. And I think the relationships to the more scholarly intellectual work that I was doing started to become impossible to ignore. And where I am now in this process, I'm about a year and a half from submitting, is to really take seriously the thoroughfares between the intellectual written practice and the intellectual visual practice. So that's kind of where I'm at. So the PhD structure at the moment, well, not at the moment, it is a practice-based PhD, which means that these components count 50-50 for what the examiners need to think about. I mean, okay, those are boring. Well, maybe not so boring, but those are sort of structural questions about how this work is framed, and I think that they are quite important to preface this talk with, because those structural questions provide at once a framework, a conceptual framework, a physical framework, and an administrative framework. But I think in terms of thinking about sight, they propose the first site of dissemination of the work. And I think that for me is important, because the work starts from an engagement with site specificity. And the idea of site specificity, I think through, you know, from the kinds of energies that were present in contemporary visual art. Can you guys see me? I'm using scare quotes to sort of like distance myself from what that possibly could mean. Do you see my image as well as the screen? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes, cool. Okay, so this kind of idea of site specificity emerges in a moment in the 60s, where there was an intense kind of activism and politicization of art in response to a nascent and emergent globalization, to kind of Cold War politics, and the kind of hegemony and capture of the art world by market forces. So there were queer performers and artists, feminists, post-colonial, or kind of, I think decolonial was not quite the term at that moment, energies that were trying to rethink and specifically de-link the idea of artistic creative practice from the object of the artwork that's sold and traded. So there's a kind of intense set of energies around that moment, which gives birth to a flurry of non-object-based works. So Lucy Lippard's Dematerializing the Art Object is an interesting point that captures some of that energy in a North American context, at least, and that gives birth to the moment of this idea called site specificity, which is a practice that emerges at that moment. The idea is you move outside of the gallery, you think about the space as something that can be engaged with. You think about the politics, the ideologies, and the kind of workings of space as a vital component in how the work, whether it's object, performative, or conceptual, starts to operate. So a part of this work is to do somewhat of a conceptual genealogy, thinking through the idea of site specificity, but challenging it because it becomes somewhat of a genre and gets denuded of its critical potential, I think, in the way that it sort of like occupies, a very, very ambivalent space now as to what it is. And I think that that's not just with site specificity. I think that generally that political moment in the 60s of an oppositional force against the market in terms of contemporary art, well, I mean, we could think about where we are at the moment with, kind of Art Basel multiplying across different cities, whether it's Miami, Dubai, kind of like doing its thing, the kind of capture, if you want, of the market forces of the contemporary visual art world has been quite intense. I think what's going to be interesting to look at in the next period to follow is what, and that's I think on the one hand a very purely economic thing. What does this global pandemic do in terms of people wanting to buy artwork? Very simply, so what does the market value of the artwork, which has become bigger than we've ever known, and so big that in fact, at least I feel that the critical energies that resist galleries, Kunsthalle, and museums, even biennales, which start to look more like art fairs. I mean, what seemed to be a very kind of lackluster set of critical energies, perhaps, well, let's see what happens now. So that's the kind of context in which I locate this work. But I mean, it's not only that. What I'm looking at, and this is a very sort of like strange and complex diagram that I've been working on, and add names and take out names. And Taban, I think there's a couple of correspondences there that are interesting. But I mean, definitely someone like Sun Ra and Afrofuturism and Kojo Eshun, I kind of like was thinking, oh God, maybe they need to go into this map somewhere. I mean, the idea with this map is to think about how I'm holding a theoretical framework around this body of work, and by body of work I include the practice as well as the writing. Because I'm very much interested to think about the relationships between the two. I mean, I'm not going to get overly theoretical in this moment. Just wonder if there's anything I should pick up from here. But I think the idea of critique is kind of important here. Critique in relationship to aesthetics, and I'm already looking at, and I wish this wasn't a PDF so I could start moving things around while I'm looking at it, because some of the ideas. Look, so the idea of the apparatus and the dispositif are complex ideas that come from Agamben and Foucault, but I'm really interested in this point of where those concepts meet aesthetics. And of course, aesthetics, there's a way in which that should be complicated and problematized, and maybe it should be better written as a thesis. But for me, there's a way in which I'm really interested in thinking about, and I guess is there a line that goes through this, because I'm suggesting a kind of X and Y axis. So where's the curve? But there's a kind of way in which, for me, what does it mean to think through the apparatus of the lens, the camera, which is a technology, but more than a technology, because it comes with a range of politics, discourses, histories, and power relationships, which is why the idea of a dispositif or an apparatus seems to open up more in thinking about lens-based epistemologies, or how the lens, the camera, produces a certain form of knowledge, or an approach to knowledge, or an approach to asking questions of things, quite simply. So there's a way, and further than that, how then does the gallery or the museum also propose an apparatus or dispositif that frames, contextualizes, and produces knowledge in a very specific kind of way. Now, I think the idea of site specificity, for me, is quite interesting, in that at a certain point it starts to recognize that it's not just about moving outside of these conventional art spaces, but understanding that the white cube itself is the site, and itself gives meaning to objects. And that meaning that it gives to objects is different to how those objects would operate if they were in other places. So for me, the thinking about the intellectual project, which is a scholarly project that involves a theoretical framework and a literature review, alongside this idea of thinking about what do images hold as by ways of producing knowledge. Yeah, I'm not sure why I put this work here, but it emerged yesterday in conversation with someone about another project. And this was from an older body of work where I was taking photographs of cricket pitches after they'd been used. And there was something about the ways in which the traces and the scars of this pitch started to suggest some form of action. And there's a certain kind of religiosity associated with the way that I was thinking about these images. You know, the cricket pitch becoming a focal point of intense reflection and focus. You know, I mean, there was a kind of loose idea of thinking about the Kaaba in Makkah, the way that these markings suggest a kind of patterning. I was reminded of lingam sculptures in India. And I think there's a whole range of things that this project was trying to do to rethink this kind of, these sets of colonial ideas, and perhaps very violent colonial ideas from different perspectives. So I'm going to go through, a couple of this is a new part of the project. I'm going to sort of very, very quickly and loosely think through a couple of people, a couple of other artists, in trying to kind of carve out a space of where this theory and practice PhD exists. And the first one that I want to look at is Joe Ratcliffe, who I think in an ongoing body of work, not just these books, because these are books which are the product of multiple shows and they were edited into these books, start to think about spaces that have borne witness to conflict and the aftermath of conflict. And there's a way in which, I mean, this is not as interesting for me as some of these other ones, where there's an idea of the landscape as being witness to forces of history. And I think there's something really important there. What starts to happen in someone else's country is something slightly different, but it's part of a similar kind of look. I mean, I think, I mean, I was struggling to find images here, but I was really interested in the images that show very little of any discernible trace of some form of colonial conflict or some form of war that, and she's photographing in Namibia and Angola mainly. So the big wars that are fought there that bear witness, or that the landscape bears witness to. And I think what I'm pointing to in these works is how the landscape in itself starts to possess qualities of witnessing, of traces, of scarring, which I think is something that's very important in the Paradise Fallen body of work, in the sense that landscape is much more than just a location, a set, much more than mise-en-scène. In fact, narratively, it is a highly potent character, if you want, in itself. And I think there's something that some of Joe Ratcliffe's photographs do in an interesting way. I mean, there's been an interesting discussion and critique, perhaps, of Joe's work in the sense of where are the people. I think that's a very important question. And then what I think is also a very important question is, in thinking about the apparatus of the camera, who is she as the photographer? So it's not just the fact that you look at this image and you know by looking at this image where Joe Ratcliffe is standing, because if you understand how the camera works, you see this image, she's standing where you are standing, looking at it, right? So she's there, peering at the viewfinder, through the viewfinder, at Luanda, and trying to make sense and understand a whole range of emotional, psychic, historical, but also contemporary processes. And if you read some of the writing in which she or the interviews she does around this work, it's about talking about the boys and the brothers who've been sent to fight, right? So she's very much talking from that position of a white South African in relationship to a conflict that's going on in Southwest Africa, which shows that kind of like general category for that side. And I think that there's something that's important to pick up in that relationship, because what happens is that I believe that the photographer is an important part of that apparatus of photography, right? The discursive ideological encounter of capturing an image or making an image. So there's a relationship here, because I think for me, even though you hardly see people in the work, for me, the person that then becomes foregrounded by the omission or the absence of any people is the personhood of the photographer. And I think that there's something there that's quite interesting. Another body of work that I think is very important for me to look at in terms of this project is the work of John Okomfra. And I think what's interesting here is how Okomfra does figure or does use the human figure in the work. And I think that this is present in quite a few of Okomfra's works, where there is, and I'm just pulling up his website, where it's filled with human figures. And the human figures are very important in how they activate the landscape. And I think what happens in Okomfra's work is something about how in a process of figuration, as a viewer, you locate yourself at the point of the image within the landscape where the figure stands. What's really interesting about this work is how the figure turns away from the landscape at this moment. And this is a video, so this is just a still from it. But there's kinds of, what's really interesting about Okomfra's work is how the landscape starts to operate in in a really sublime kind of way, in the sense of that kind of aesthetic concept of the sublime that Kant was part of writing, where there's a kind of overpoweringness of the landscape, and sometimes a devastating overpoweringness of the landscape. The conference work is difficult because there's not a lot of it that you can find online. But there's also a very serious loss of watching whatever you do find online, because a really important part of the installations is being present in the space. They're very kind of precisely crafted spaces, and the conference got to the point where he can command fairly huge budgets in purpose building these spaces. So being in that space is something that is quite important to the work. The immersive video installations. The recent one that I saw called Purple was, I think, a 6 or 7 screen video installation, and all of the screens synced up and really kind of working in terms of sound and image in a very precise way. But I think even some of the images, you get an idea of the sublime that I think is something that is operative in my work, which needs more unpacking in terms of the other concepts of dispositive apparatus, a general idea of aesthetics or aesthesis, and importantly of critique. So where does the place of critique potentially lie in producing these ideas of the sublime? And I think that's something that I need to do some work in thinking through a confrel with, and then tracking back to my own work. I was, while I was looking at this image, it struck me that there was a similarity to another image, which is sometimes used as the sort of archetypal placeholder for thinking about the sublime in aesthetics or contemporary visual art. Well, this is not contemporary, but a German romantic form from the 1800s. So it's a famous example of thinking about the sublime, of thinking about how the viewer figures themselves at the point of view of that person. But then it's not that simple. What a confrere does is complicates who that person is and how that figuration operates, right? So of course, and there's an interesting resonance to the previous discussion. In a theory of the sublime, there is no real engagement with the idea of race, right? And I would say also gender, in terms of how then does the person that you are seduced, coerced, maybe is a better word, coerced into identifying with, often is the white male protagonist. And this happens in novels and films and all sorts of things. And I think part of a conference project is to destabilize that very neat idea of subjectification or identification. I sort of went into a range. This is another David Friedrich image, and I think there's something about the landscape here that again, that I'm thinking through. But I'm thinking through this in video terms and not filmic and not painterly terms. The idea of landscapes and colonialism, the American school of Hudson, the Hudson School of Painters in the US, there's an idea of painting the landscape as to capture it, as to own it, as to show people, across the Atlantic in Europe, look, this is the place, this is the promised land, let's all come here and settle and claim it. So there's a kind of fantasy, a colonial fantasy, and a series of colonial desires of the landscape, which I think are very important for me to think about in the kind of video work that I'm doing and the photographic work that I'm doing. And there's our own masters, Hugo Naudier, Pierre Neef. I mean, these are just they're prompts for me to think about the idea of the landscape and what the landscape means in painterly terms, even though my interest is more photographically. So I mean, the cycle of work, Paradise Fallen, this is an image that I made in the Koklamba Drakensberg Mountains on the other side of the Malutis. And that's the new body of work I'm working on or the new film I'm working on in this body of work. is set around that mountain range. And what's interesting about that mountain range, well, there's many things that are interesting about the mountain range. The idea of Lesotho is part of that. The idea of Lesotho being the space of exile, the space of refuge, and the way in which in the anti-apartheid movement, that was a space that you could seek some kind of refuge if you were a combatant and you needed to leave the country. But then Lesotho has been a point of holding out against colonial forces for a much longer period. So there's a kind of idea in which Lesotho metaphorically, symbolically, and in real sort of like physical aesthetic terms, just, I mean, being in those mountains is something quite, I mean, there's a power that you feel, a timelessness that you feel, that you really understand these mountains as something much more than the kind of physical or material things that they're made of. In fact, I was talking about this project with Donna Kukama, a friend of mine and an artist, and she said, well, I sent her a photograph by WhatsApp, and she said, "Oh wow, those are bookmarks in the page. Those mountains are bookmarks in the pages of our history." And it says, I thought there was something really potent about how they stand as these sort of placeholders for all sorts of ideas. And I think I'm throwing my own ideas, my own questions, my own desires, my own politics, and my own kind of searching for or searching through all of these things to the landscape. And I'm throwing it via the lens of the camera, and I'm processing it through the editing software that I use. And in that relationship, I'm trying to negotiate how this landscape operates as more than just location or place, but is produced as very much through a series of encounters that have important psychic, emotional, emotive, and I guess what I'm thinking, and this is where it taps into the sublime, that there are seriously metaphysical dimensions to these things. This is another image I made. I've been processing this image and playing with them, and I've been, this is the last point of playing with it, where it takes on some kind of a lenticular form, where if you stand back at a specific distance and sort of like squint your eyes, you can see both the images at the same time. There's something interesting about the idea of double vision or lenticular vision that I'm working with. The order of this is wrong, because this should have been earlier. So this is Douglas Gordon's 24-hour cycle, which I see I'm running out of time. So I'm going to end with going the work. 24-hour cycle, I'll leave that for now. I mean, if someone wants to talk about 24-hour cycle and Taxi Driver, we can. So this is the first film that I made, which was shot, and I've showed it twice already. I've shown it first at Femme of Color, a space that Gabrielle Goliath was running in Newtown, and second, I showed it at the Point of Order, a space that WITS School of Art runs in Braamfontein, and that was last year. So it's a video. I think some of you might have got the link to the video and you may have seen it, but it was working and working over the period of the last 10 years out of the raw material company in Dakar. And the engagement with the landscape around the peninsula, or the oceanscape or the seascape, was something that I've spent a long time photographing. And it was only 3 or 4 years ago that I started to work in a more systematic way to shoot this film. And the film is really around this, what I produce as a fictitious landscape narratively, in that it's not obviously or literally Dakar or any particular island. In fact, it's shot across 4 islands, one of the islands being Ile de Gorée, which is a space that is a memorial, it's a memory space that pays homage to the transatlantic slave trade. And there's some interesting things that emerge in how that space where the capture of human bodies was enacted to send as cargo across the ocean becomes captured again today by a tourist economy, where French tourists go to sunbathe outside the House of Slaves. And there's some seriously strange things that happen there. I mean, it's sort of like there's a way in which Europe produces Africa as the porno tropics, even at this memorial space for slavery. I mean, I've never been to Auschwitz, but I doubt people would go there for a packed lunch and a picnic and sunbathe in the lawns. I don't know, maybe they do. But I was really struck by the strange and very complex ways in which that point, that most Western point of the continent thinks about slavery in terms of the transatlantic slavery. But there were people in my time there who reminded that was not the first slavery that the people of West Africa were subjected to. And in fact, caravans came from the East, taking slaves to the Arabian Peninsula. So there was, so there's a kind of way in which I think the memory, the history, and the politics and the emotions that come with that were very much present in my mind when writing the voiceover for this film and thinking about what this work was. Just going to quickly go through some other things. Do I need to stop soon? I think we've got 20 minutes left. So I mean, just to sum up, the work, the practical body of work, circles around a 3-screen installation. So there's 3 films and a series of drawings that accompany it. The idea is to think through space or site and site specificity against the grain in which it becomes captured within contemporary visual art, and to think around the metaphysical, the dematerial, the deterritorialized ideas of site and space in relationship to landscape, but also in relationship to the space of the museum where this gets installed. So this was the Femme of Color, and it's I mean, it just shows the scale of the video installation. These are some of the drawings that go with it. I mean, I can make this PDF available, and I can send links to whoever wants to look more at this. Details. Yeah, and there were other video works that come with it. But I think in the interest of having a discussion, I'm going to stop there.
Zen, thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, the content of it was really compelling, and understanding where you're coming from in your work. I'm really interested in how the work, or how you situate the work that you're doing within the context of practice-based research. It seemed to me as if you, at the beginning, you set up quite a complex location, intellectual or theoretical location for your work that seems not reconciled, something that you're still kind of working through, and it's sort of riven with an implicit complexity. But then when you start talking about the work, there's something that seems very fluid about it. You reference Akomfra's work, you reference Caspar David Friedrich's work, and then there's this sort of fluidity that emerges from that. And I'm just curious about the mode of research that you're pursuing, whether you see that there's a theoretical component to your research, and then there's the work that you do that runs in parallel to it, or are you trying to in a sense justify the work within a theoretical context, or are you trying to theorize the work? I'm just curious about that relationship between theory and between practice, and I'm particularly interested in practice-based research, which is the the reason for my question. So could you talk a little bit about that, about how you see the relationship of those things? Because again, just to reinforce, the motivations that you reveal in showing the references of your work and the idea of the metaphysics and those very beautiful photographs of the Drakensberg and so on seem to be quite remote from, essentially remote from the theorizing that you're doing. So I'd like you to speak about the relationship between those things in your mind. Maybe they're not resolved, but I'm just curious to hear your feelings on that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I mean, I think the idea of resolution is an important one to think about, and I think I've been resisting resolving this or solving this, and the question of the relationship between the theoretical and the practical is also one that I'm quite hesitant in a couple of things. The one thing is, well, maybe it's a better posed as questions. The one question is, how does the work come into the final submission? Does one, or do I document it and represent it in a dossier that goes alongside the theoretical writing, or do I engage with or perform the mode of the art historian or the art critic, who then does a kind of analysis on the work, and I think that there's something quite complex for me about being the producer and the analyst at the same time. It's like, am I going to sit on both sides of the couch in playing the analyst and the analyst and there's something kind of perverse about that, which I have started doing. I've started writing about the work and trying to kind of explore it, which is where some of the ideas of or the theoretical kind of points of inquiry start to emerge from. So that process of writing, I think, is very useful in some way. But to what extent does that writing become subject to submission of this sort of fairly sort of heavy and burdened, I would say overburdened form of gatekeeping in knowledge practice. So the kind of conferment of a doctorate being a kind of very precise institutional thing. And let's be very, very clear about how overburdened it is. You in most countries, it changes your position as a citizen. So basically, when you go to Home Affairs, you press a drop-down box. You can choose Mr., Mrs., Ms., or Doctor, right? So, I mean, I could stop being a Mr. and become a doctor. I can change myself fundamentally through this process and of course, the examiners in the university and Senate needs to approve this, and I'll become something else than I am now. So it is overburdened. And I think that then, in terms of that framework of what the doctor of philosophy suggests, I'm very cautious about what I am proposing, because whatever I submit performatively articulates one thing before any of the content or any of the theory or anything else. It proposes that this is legitimate knowledge production in fulfillment of a doctorate. That's the first thing that any degree or submission for a degree says. It says, it declares very loudly that this is doctoral work. So I feel the stakes being very high in that, which is why the writing on the work or about the work, and that writing is very clumsy. I keep on prefacing this kind of thing about what is the aboutness, what does it mean to speak about something, you speak in place of something. I mean, I'm not saying, and I'm not in that position of the art must speak for itself, because I think, as somebody who is co-journeying with the images and the ideas that I produce, I do have something to say about it. So I think that there's something there that, is it at the level of responsibility where I then need to not let the work be silent or not kind of insist that it speaks for itself, but also that I'm not convinced that I can kind of craft this theoretical component and then submit a dossier of images next to it and then leave it for the reader to to make the relationships themselves. I mean, I think, and by way of where I would see resolution happening, I do need to sort of stake a claim to where I see that relationship. Now for me, that's something that is an exploration about meaning. It's an exploration about writing. It's an exploration of how one thinks theory works in relationship to an object of analysis. And you know, there are multiple examples from different disciplines. I think anthropology, there's a lot to learn from anthropology, where they constantly are very, you know, I mean, I would say glibly, you know, tortured in terms of their relationship to the object of their analysis, because their object of analysis has often been people who they coerced or captured and studied, right? So there's quite rightly a kind of very serious mistrust about the relationship between a theoretical framework and the object of analysis. And I think that that's something that, you know, I would structurally take on in metering my wanting to apply the theory to the work as case study. But my ideal kind of way of thinking about that is something of a mutually beneficial relationship, where there's a thoroughfare, there's a conversation between theory and practice. And I think that that's been happening, in the sense that I've been doing both parts of it simultaneously. And as I read, as I shoot, as I edit, as I write, this kind of thing snowballs into, you know, what you see as that mind map, or that concept map, which you know is so absurd in terms of how I look at it, because it's you know, that's not actually realizable. And in fact, the work needs to be a lot more fine-tuned, focused, and directed. But that's also something that, you know, to the chagrin of my supervisors, I'm resisting. And that's probably why I'm going into a 5th year of my PhD. But there's, you know, I think for me, the responsibility, and there I will talk about responsibility of producing postgraduate work, is to understand very clearly the performative function of it, that you are asserting, and you are asserting for other people who will research in the libraries and look at your work, that this is what the relationship between theory and practice is. And that's it's a frightening prospect.
Hi, Zen. Thank you so much for that. It's incredibly interesting. But I'm really curious. The work is so absolutely site-specific. It takes into account so much about where and how it's made. And how do you translate that into the spaces or sites that you choose for your gallery representation, to quote you from earlier?
Well, I mean, I'm not represented by a gallery. If there's anyone from a gallery out there, it's not because I'm antithetical to it. I'll happily sign, but I'm not, and I don't work with galleries, not because of any deeper reason, but I'm just not signed. So the places that I show are more often than not independent project spaces or residencies. So the Raw Material Company in Dakar is the first place that this cycle of work was shown, the ones that have already been produced. And that's, you know, it's run by, what was run by the now director of ZITES, Moka Koyo, and that's a very fluid, open, non-commercial cultural center. Femme of Color was an independent space run by Gabrielle Goliath for a short period of time. It's now moved and gone with her to another space, so it's not closed completely, but it's just shifted location. So there's a kind of way in which the conversations with the people who run those spaces are quite important, and there's a relational moment that informs how that work is shown. I mean, the idea of creating these video installations within such a space is a process of bracketing it off from the outside world. And I think that there's something there which is, maybe it's ironic, but there's something that's worth thinking about. And I haven't reconciled what that actually means, but it's not the white cube, right? It's more the idea of the black box. So it's a heavily soundproofed blackened space that allows the image to exist, almost to float and to immerse the viewer into a kind of, and it's not a cinematic experience which is restricted to the screen. It's a cinematic experience which is spatial, right? So it moves. The cinematic experience kind of works all across the space, and they're in kind of the curation of other objects, and sometimes those objects are monitors with other video work, supporting video work on it, or the drawings start to become important. So there's a space that you move through in understanding this. So for me, that is an important site to consider as well. It's a site that's ideologically loaded, that's not neutral, that has a tradition and an economy and an ecology that it works in a similar way that the academy or the university and the PhD has also in a certain kind of power in producing site. So, I mean, the spaces that I work, the Maluti mountain range, the islands of Dakar, the final piece is going to be shot in the Karoo and the Northern Cape. I mean, those spaces in themselves, with your physical presence in them, will do something else and do something very different to my mediation of those spaces via the apparatus of the camera and relocation of those images into this black box space. So I think for me, part of the intellectual and epistemological question is, what does that dislocation of space do? What does that relocation of one site into another? It's about absence, right? It's about absence and presence, right? Because you are standing in front of something that is not there, right? There's that photographic relationship that people like Roland Barthes write about, photography and absence. So I'm not sure it's fully answering the question, but I think for me, I'm really interested in turning site and site specificity back into questioning the infrastructures, institutions, discourses, and ideologies that come with it of the essay and the exhibition, because those are the two sites in which the PhD is produced, and that sort of that's the appropriate conventional site of this kind of work, and I'm very concerned on picking that up and really kind of getting the critique to turn in on itself, if that makes sense.